Hello, I'm Nicholas Henshall. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's here in Groombridge in the High Weald of East Sussex. And this is the first in a series for Lent around the New Testament, exploring the New Testament. In the weeks to come, we're going to look at each Gospel in turn, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, although not quite in that order. And today I simply want to, if you like, lay out the contents of the New Testament and say something about how I think it's constructed and how it works and kind of what it's for. But I also want you to have those conversations yourselves, however you're meeting and however you're engaging with this Lent 2024. So what is the New Testament? Well, let's deal with that word testament at first, because testament is a word that means covenant, God's covenant with his people, and the Old Covenant, very much God and his relationship with the people of Israel. And of course, Christians regard the Old Testament as part of their scripture. Christians have in common with Jews the Old Testament as a key and fundamental. Indeed, for the first 200 years of Christianity, the Old Testament was the Christian Bible. There was no separate New Testament as such, as we'll discover. Of course, the Old Testament covers some 3,000 years of history, of poetry, of reflection, of prophecy, and so forth. The New Testament, by contrast, is written in a very short space of time between around 60 AD to around 70, maybe 90 AD. Much shorter time scale, and of course reflecting not on the whole history of a people, but on the life of Jesus Christ. So what's in the New Testament? Maybe we're very familiar with this, maybe not, but it's always worth catching up, renewing our knowledge. So fundamentally, there are three different kinds of writing in the New Testament. The earliest are the letters. That may sound surprising, because I'm sure we all think, oh, the Gospels come first because they come first in the order of the books. But no, the letters come first. They are the first written part of the New Testament. Indeed, the first written documents of Christianity, and particularly the letters of Paul, which we'll come back to in a moment. The second is the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Very similar, but also very contrasting lives of Jesus. And the third kind, which we are probably least familiar with, is the final book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, a book that was a bit like the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, only kind of just got in there in the last minute. The same way with Revelation, people were still questioning whether it should be in the New Testament right into the 3rd century. But there it is, and I think actually it's important, and we'll come to that in due time. So, the writings of the New Testament begin with Paul, this remarkable figure who has an extraordinary experience that changes him from being a persecutor of the church and an Orthodox Jew to being a Christian who is seeking to follow this Lord, who is met in an extraordinary spiritual encounter on the road to Damascus. Then he spends 3 years, doing what we're not entirely clear, but Tom Wright, the great New Testament scholar, suggests that he spends those 3 years in Arabia essentially reflecting on that experience as the foundation stone for the next bit of the journey. And the next bit of the journey is essentially a series of journeys as he travels around the Eastern Mediterranean, what we call Turkey, around the islands, around Greece, and then eventually ending up in Rome, having been put on trial in the Middle East. So quite a story. He gets shipwrecked, all sorts of things happen to him along the way. And he writes a series of letters. He's a founder of churches. And to the churches he's founded, he sends letters. Now, we don't have all of them. That's clearly true. And the ones we do have, some of them may not be as complete as we think they are. Some would suggest some of them aren't by Paul, but I don't go down that line particularly. These are the ones the church has recognised as Pauline in the deepest sense. I want to say something briefly about 2 of his letters, and then we'll move on to the Gospels. Because it seems to me the heart of Paul's message is to be found in Galatians and in Romans. I'm not trying to privilege them from the others, which are very definitely part of the New Testament, part of Scripture, but I think they give the insight into Paul's vision of what Christianity is all about. He uses poetry, he uses rhetoric, he uses argument, he sometimes gets completely carried away, and he also makes mistakes. Please never think, and the Bible never says it, that the Bible, New and Old Testaments are somehow without error. Of course they are. These are written down by human beings. And one of the classic cases is in Paul, where he quotes from Psalm 68 and gets the quote completely wrong. not just a bit wrong, but actually makes it say the opposite of what it actually says in the original text. I rather like that. Not because I want to think of it as fallible, but because it's a fallible human being. And somehow we can rejoice and be comforted by that, I think, along the way. No, the New Testament, like the Old Testament, never claims to be infallible or without error. These are written by fallible human beings, in response, of course, to the inspiration and call of the Lord. But Galatians and Romans, two extraordinary letters, one to different churches, sure, but one in their fundamental theology, and it's Paul's fundamental theology, which is, we can do nothing to save ourselves. God has saved us, and we're invited to live in response to that gift. Gosh, that's about it. You can see parallels directly back to Ezekiel in the Old Testament, whose line is, yes, God is sovereign, and for the sake of my name, I'll always bring you home, even though you're rubbish. I mean, that's Ezekiel's line. Well, Paul has something similar. Paul recognises sin. Sin is one of Paul's big words. It doesn't mean doing naughty things. I think we get very confused about it. Sin in Paul is his description of what it means to be human, that we're fallible, we're messed up, we make terrible mistakes. He admits the same of himself. But God has redeemed us. God is redeemers, and God will redeem us forever. God has saved us, is saving us, and will save us for eternity. That is the promise of the good news of Jesus Christ. It's a gift freely given. Paul uses the word grace, indeed a big word in all Christianity, to mean God's free gift of himself. And it's a free gift to which we can choose not to respond. The gift is given. It's up to us what we do with it. And of course, part of the purpose of the church is to be a school of the Lord's service, where we learn how to respond to that extraordinary gift given at such a cost by Jesus' death and resurrection. So Paul's all about that free gift, freely offered. I know we have all sorts of other views on Paul, but that's the centre of his theology. And if I'm right, and many don't necessarily agree with this, then Galatians is possibly the first written letter of Paul. I love that because it's all there already. The Holy Trinity, the divinity of Christ, everything we need, and the promise of salvation without boundaries. So that's Paul. That's the first written stuff in the New Testament, although not the first in the order of the texts. What about the Gospels? We have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, though we're going to actually deal with those in a slightly different order for a reason I hope will become obvious next time. The Gospels are essentially biographies of Jesus. In the old days, we used to say, no, they're a unique genre, until we realised they're, in fact, exactly the same as the biographies of the Hellenistic world, that period in which Jesus lived. They are typical of biographies in the ancient world. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, in different ways, and remember, none of them sign those documents. Paul signs his letters. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John do not sign their Gospels. They may be the right names, and that's fine, and there are lots of ancient traditions about that, but people didn't sign documents, sign their work in the way they do today. They weren't in search of celebrity. And what have we got in those contrasting accounts? And they are contrasting. Well, let's start with Mark, because I think that's really important. Mark's Gospel is the first, almost certainly the first written down Gospel that we have. Written possibly about 60 AD at the earliest, maybe later. Some people would put it some 30 years later, but that's another matter. Dating the Gospels is really quite difficult. Mark's Gospel, the shortest, only 16 short chapters, and he loves the word immediately. It's full of action. Things happen from the very first moment to the very last moment. It's unusual from our perspective, probably because we know Matthew, Luke and John, that in Mark we don't have any birth stories and we don't have any resurrection appearances. We'll get to that when we look at that next week. But short, punchy, a sense of urgency, something extraordinary is happening and we need to pay attention. Now, part of the whole thing in Mark is people don't pay attention. And indeed, the only person in Mark's Gospel to recognise who Jesus really is the centurion standing beside his cross. We'll go into that into greater detail when we study Mark directly. So Mark, full of action, live programme of miracles, of healing, and then the journey to Jerusalem and Christ's death and resurrection. Now, when we get to the other Gospels, certainly Matthew and Luke, we need to note at the very beginning is all of Mark is in both of them. Almost completely, 90% of what Mark writes, sometimes in exactly the same wording, is covered by both Matthew and Luke. But they also had their other sources, their own sources. And Matthew and Luke, like Mark, are of course writing to particular audiences. Their churches are different, their cultures are different, they're in different places. Traditionally, Mark is thought to be written in the city of Rome. Maybe that's true, we simply don't know. But where you write something and your audience, your congregation, your community changes how you write. And so it's not surprising that Matthew, Mark, and in a very different way, John, are contrasting pictures of Jesus. That's what we want, isn't it? We want to. That's the point of having four Gospels, that we can see different aspects of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Matthew probably will assume to be writing to a community which has a very strong Jewish background. And that accounts for a lot of the detail in Matthew, where he uses a lot of Jewish references and potentially Jewish structures in quite a contrasting. Let me mention a very simple one. Most of the Gospels talk about the kingdom of heaven. Matthew talks about the kingdom of the heavens, a very Hebraic phrase. Interestingly, in modern translations, that tends to be missed out, and I think that's a real shame. So Matthew, a teaching gospel. In Matthew, Jesus is very much the teacher. 5 blocks of teaching, training for discipleship to the inner circle of the 12. As for Luke, Luke has a preface to his gospel, which is very telling. He says, I've sat down to write an orderly account of the things that have happened among us. Right. He knows Matthew, he knows Mark, and he's thinking, actually, I can do better. That's a bit much, isn't it? Well, he's certainly writing in better Greek. He also writes an awful lot. In fact, Luke writes more of the New Testament than any other author, because he also writes the Acts of the Apostles, which is essentially what happens after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, the mission of the church as it kicks off. But Luke's gospel is also very characterizing of Jesus as, if you like, the friend of our frailty. A deep sense in Luke, and he was a doctor by trade, and many people think that affects this in a positive way. There's a deep sense that Jesus understands exactly what it is to be human in Luke's gospel, a sense that he's put on our flesh, become a human being for our sakes, and knows exactly what that feels like. That he knows the despair of what it means to be human, and also he reaches out beyond that. So there are some very unique stories in Luke. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the lost son, which are all about re-including people in community, welcoming people home even if they don't deserve it, a sense of the utter generosity of God, who knows how frail we are and yet always wants to heal our wounds and bring us back. Also in Luke, but it's there in the other Gospels, I'm very fascinated with some of the healing miracles where there's a perfectly good word for heal in Greek, but actually Jesus often used the word salvation. Your faith has saved you, not your faith has healed you. I think that's very important, because salvation in the New Testament is not about me getting saved, it's about us being re-included in community. That's again and again the core theme of the miracles. And Luke's depiction of the crucifixion is also quite different in ethos, not in fact, but in ethos, from Matthew and Mark. And what about John? Well, a few words on John. John is quite different in structure, built around a series of 6 or 7 signs, as he calls them. No birth narratives, but beginning with that extraordinary poem, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Quite extraordinarily different. One of the biggest differences, if we take sort of Mark, where nobody works out who Jesus is until the end, in John's Gospel, everybody knows who Jesus is from the very beginning. You cannot miss it. This is the King of Glory. This is the King of Glory on a journey of glory. He is unassailable in that sense. And the crucifixion, as some great writers have said, in John's Gospel is not so much a passion narrative as Christ sitting on his throne of glory. The cross is a moment of the highest glory and wonder in John's Gospel, quite different from what we might find in the other Gospels. So these are contrasting pictures of Jesus. And they're all important, they're all very significant, and draw us in to knowing and understanding more deeply the life of Jesus. But let me say something important in this whole series. This is not about head knowledge, about knowing more. Understanding really helps, of course, yes. But actually it's about heart knowledge. The deeper we go with the Gospels, and that's part of the purpose of the daily prayers through Lent, is the more we are formed in the image of Christ. The more we can put on Christ, the more we can become Christ for other people. The servant king who came to serve us and love us and seeks our response to that extraordinary gift of which Paul speaks so powerfully. And finally, some words on the book of Revelation. Revelation is quite extraordinary, written very late, Not written almost certainly by John, the person we associate with the Gospel, but by a different John, John often called John the theologian in the early church, probably in what we would call Turkey in Asia Minor, traditionally Ephesus. Now, this John is probably an old man. If we've got the right one, it's really difficult. On Patmos, on the island of Patmos, is it the same John or isn't it? We're not going there today anyway. The author of Revelation is different, I would suggest, from the author of the Gospels. We'll get onto that when we get on to John's Gospel. But the heart of Revelation, which is a very confusing book, and many people have been shipwrecked, I would suggest, by putting too much on Revelation, is read the signs of the times. Read the signs of the times and pay attention. Pay attention is a big word in Jesus' ministry, but it seems to be really fantastic that we've got a book at the end of the New Testament which invites us to look for the signs of the times and pay attention, because the world is not as it should be. Well, we know that. And I think reading Revelation is difficult, but is something we should attempt precisely because it's inviting us to pay attention to the world in which we live and to the Lord who came into that world to bring salvation, not for human beings, but as John's Gospel says, but for the renewal of the whole created order, the cosmos, the whole created order which God has come to save and has saved for eternity.